In 1980, director Michael Cimino's film Heaven's Gate failed so spectacularly that its title became synonymous with disaster for many years. Even Kevin Costner's Waterworld in 1995 was mockingly referred to by the press as Kevin's Gate, hinting at a looming box office fiasco. Heaven's Gate is considered the film that led Hollywood studios to start closely monitoring directors and retain full creative control. So, for all the current situations where studios interfere with someone's work, directors should be grateful to Heaven's Gate and Michael Cimino himself. Initially, Heaven's Gate seemed like a guaranteed success for United Artists. They had director Michael Cimino, whose previous film, The Deer Hunter, was a box office hit and won 5 Academy Awards. At the 1979 ceremony, Michael Cimino won the Oscar for Best Director. The studio was ready to fund any idea he had, and Cimino quickly found that idea. In 1979, the studio gave him $12 million for a film based on real events that took place in Wyoming in 1890. These events later became known as the Johnson County War. At its core was a conflict between immigrants and large American cattle ranchers. Immigrants trying to establish themselves in the U.S. began stealing cattle from the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. The association didn't take kindly to this behavior, and the hitmen they hired began shooting local farmers and intimidating them. Naturally, the hired guns weren't too concerned about who was in the right, and soon innocent people started falling victim to lynchings. After one such lynching, in which Ella Watson and Jim Averill were hanged, small farmers took up arms because the American justice system had failed to protect them. 6 people arrested for the Averill family's murder were released as all the witnesses mysteriously died of gunshot wounds, and the key witness, Jim Averill's nephew, decided to ingest arsenic just before the trial. Frustrated farmers soon caught one of the guilty men and stabbed him to death with pitchforks. In response, the hitmen killed several more people. This eventually escalated into a conflict that lasted several years and ended in a bloody massacre. Another trial followed, during which all the U.S. senators involved in the events on the cattlemen's side were acquitted, and all the surviving hitmen were released because the state treasury had no funds to keep them in prison. Overall, it was an ideal story for a dramatic film about class struggle, and for Michael Cimino, it was a dream project. With an Oscar win allowing him to dictate terms, Cimino secured a fantastic contract with the studio. According to it, Cimino couldn't be penalized for going over budget as long as he finished the film within the agreed timeline. Naturally, the studio executives, thinking they were only dealing with a few extra million, overlooked this clause in the contract. The wasteful spending on the set was staggering. For example, one day, Michael Cimino decided that the distance between buildings on either side of the street was insufficient. This led to the entire street being rebuilt. Even though the producer suggested saving money by only moving the buildings on one side, Cimino refused. He insisted that the lighting would be different at the time of day he needed if only one side was moved. This particular whim cost $1.5 million. Another example of Cimino's excessive spending was his desire to build an irrigation system under the battlefield. The director wanted the grass to be bright green, which would later turn bright red after the battle. The irrigation system cost the studio another $3 million. Toward the end of production, tensions finally flared between the studio and the director. The studio, which had been pouring money into the project, began to question where all the funds were going. They were especially curious as to why they were paying such exorbitant fees for the land where filming was taking place. Upon checking the records, they discovered that the landowner was none other than Michael Cimino himself. Almost all the actors featured in the film received record-breaking fees for that time. Many of the actors were quite well known back then, so the total amount spent on salaries exceeded $10 million. Chris Christopherson, Christopher Walken, Jonathan Hurt, Sam Waterston, Isabelle Huppert, Jeff Bridges, and Tom Noonan all set new personal records. By the end of production, Heaven's Gate had reached a budget of $40 million. But that wasn't the end. The first version, made by director Michael Cimino, ran nearly 5 hours. Rumor had it that the final battle in the film could be released as a separate movie because it lasted over an hour and a half. The studio executives, horrified, demanded that Cimino cut the runtime. After long arguments with the studio, Cimino locked himself in the editing room and hired armed guards to prevent the studio from interfering in any way. Cimino eventually trimmed the film to 3.5 hours. This was the version that premiered in New York. The premiere was a disaster, which came as a complete shock to Michael Cimino. According to eyewitnesses, the director looked utterly bewildered at the premiere and couldn't understand what everyone disliked about his film. Immediately after the disastrous premiere, Cimino contacted the studio and demanded more time for another edit. The studio agreed, and Cimino recut the film to 3 hours. Incidentally, the only country where Heaven's Gate was a box office success was France, where both audiences and critics received it positively. In France, they screened the 3.5-hour version. The final budget for the Western reached an astronomical $44 million, which was one of the most expensive films in cinematic history at the time. Adjusted for inflation, Heaven's Gate is still the most expensive Western in Hollywood history. Even today's high-budget Westerns, like Django Unchained, which cost $100 million, seem to be in a different price range. Nowadays, Heaven's Gate would cost between $150 million and $160 million. Only fantastical and mystical Westerns like Wild Wild West, The Lone Ranger, and Cowboys and Aliens can compete in terms of cost. To put $44 million in 1980 into perspective, let's compare it to the budgets of other films released around the same time. The first Indiana Jones film, which hit theaters in 1981, had an $18 million budget. The Empire Strikes Back also had an $18 million budget. Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, released in 1979, cost $31 million, and Coppola later complained that they had too much money and spent more time having fun on set than filming. Flash Gordon, which flopped in the same 1980 as Heaven's Gate, cost $35 million. And this was a film produced by Dino De Laurentiis, who was known for inadequate budgets in his films. In American theaters, Heaven's Gate grossed a mere $3 million. United Artists, one of Hollywood's oldest studios and already struggling, found itself on the brink of bankruptcy. Not even the latest Bond film, For Your Eyes Only, which hit theaters in 1981, could save it. Although For Your Eyes Only grossed over $100 million worldwide, it posted disappointing numbers compared to Moonraker, which grossed over $200 million worldwide in 1979. Following this, United Artists' parent company, Transamerica, decided to sell the studio. MGM ended up being the buyer, marking the end of United Artists' 62-year run as an independent studio. After the film's release, many actors who starred in Heaven's Gate criticized the director. Tom Noonan claimed that Cimino mistreated the actors and crew and even threatened him personally with a weapon. However, some defended the director. Chris Christopherson said he was proud of the film, and Jeff Bridges stated that he had watched it multiple times and liked it more and more with each viewing. Heaven's Gate also dealt a severe blow to the Western genre. Major studios avoided Westerns until the mid-80s, and the flops of early Westerns released after 1985 were often blamed on Heaven's Gate. Exactly 10 years after Heaven's Gate premiered, Kevin Costner revived the genre with Dances with Wolves. When Kevin made the film, everyone predicted it would fail. But with a $22 million budget, the film grossed $424 million. After that, American theaters were flooded with Westerns. Michael Cimino's career took a nosedive after Heaven's Gate premiered. In 1979, he was the most hyped director with a bright future ahead of him. But after Heaven's Gate, Cimino suddenly became an outcast. 5 years after Heaven's Gate flopped, Cimino returned to the big screen with Year of the Dragon. Because Cimino had a multi-film contract with United Artists, which MGM inherited, the studio gave him another chance. But the film, starring Mickey Rourke, flopped at the box office, and Cimino was nominated for a Razzie Award. His last full-length work in cinema was the independent film Sunchaser, released in theaters in 1996. It was nominated for the Palme d'Or at Cannes, but never received a wide release. Many analysts agree that the studio could have avoided such a colossal failure with Heaven's Gate, and that the film's dismal box office performance was largely due to the complete lack of a promotional campaign. In 1980, the audience simply didn't know about the film. This happened because the studio only started worrying about Heaven's Gate when its budget had already exceeded $30 million. At that time, the studio was deeply involved in the production of For Your Eyes Only, which also had a hefty $30 million budget. When it came time to launch a promotional campaign, the studio simply had no funds left for it. And after the disastrous premiere, even the minimal effort that United Artists could have organized was redirected to the new Bond film. The studio decided that Heaven's Gate was beyond saving, and all resources needed to be thrown at Bond. Naturally, the management likely did not expect that Heaven's Gate would make only $3 million at the box office. Thank you for your attention.